Welcome to the Binary Agora. Today, we will be discussing the European Commission's issuing of a different specification proceeding against Google to set out the implementation measures to provide vertical interoperability with hardware and software features controlled by its operating system. As you will recall, if you do not, I invite you to watch the latest episode we published where we commented on the other specification proceedings issued by the Commission around Article 611. As you will recall, in a separate proceeding, the enforcer is also seeking to specify how Google should grant third-party AI service providers equally effective access to the same features as those available to Google's own services. In other words, the European Commission wants to get its foot in the door and make a difference in AI markets. It wishes to restore contestability by interpreting the vertical interoperability mandate under Article 6.7 of the DMA. To do that, it will follow the specification proceeding process and not the punitive path. By triggering this specification proceeding, it puts pen to paper in terms of what it expects from Google when providing access to its hardware and software features that are essential to power the AI functionality and features that access seekers might have to use to develop their own services and products relating to AI. And above, you'll also find a link to the first video of the channel where I explain the nuances underlying Article 6.7 of the DMA, so the vertical interoperability mandate. The European Commission already used this type of procedure regarding Apple's compliance with Article 6.7, and it came up with quite a detailed set of instructions of how it expects Apple to comply with the effective interoperability threshold. We can therefore expect the same procedure to apply in Google's case. With us today is Jan Krämer, a full professor at the University of Passau, where he holds the chair of Internet and Telecommunications Business. He's also the co-director of the DFG Research and Training Group 2720 on digital platform ecosystems. And many of you will also know Jan from his role as an academic co-director at CER and his many articles on how technology intersects with competition law, competition policy. So welcome to the Agora, Jan.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
So as we commented on previously, the European Commission has opened this DMA specification proceeding to set out the implementation measures that Google must comply with to achieve effective compliance with Article 6.7, the vertical interoperability obligation. And the most salient aspect of the proceeding is that the enforcer seeks to specify how the gatekeeper should grant third-party AI service providers equally effective access to the same features as those available to Google's own services. So to start the conversation going, I wanted to ask you whether this really makes sense, specifically bearing in mind that Article 6.7 applies to operating systems and not other services such as, for instance, search engines.
I think it's a very interesting and probably also needed investigation at this point because, of course, Google's Android is designated as a core platform service under the DMA, and as such, 6.7 applies. That services Google that are potentially not designated yet, like Gemini, for example, whatever access it gives to its own AI features and tools and services on its operating system, it would also have to provide potential third-party competitors. And the idea is that the market stays, as the DMA would call it, contestable or open for competition by these third-party, let's say, AI chatbots, AI agents in the future, so that Google does not get an advantage for its Gemini on its own operating system, which others would not be able to duplicate. What are we talking about? We're potentially talking about very simple things like same access to the CPU feature. They might have a special CPU, which gives some special sort of access for AI models, but also access to potentially, documents, sensors on the device. And of course, also, when we talk about AI and AI agents, we have to differentiate between sort of two types: the ones that run on device, which will become more and more important also in the future because devices are becoming more powerful, so you can run more powerful models also on the device. Of course, when you run a model on the device, it has less latency, it typically gives a quicker response, it has less privacy implications because you don't need to send the data out somewhere, you're not relying on a good internet connection when you do it. So these devices run on device, and then of course, you can also have models that run in the cloud where you send something off in the cloud. I guess it's particularly also for these potential models that can run on device where the access to the operating system is particularly tight and where you could give your own a little bit more advantage.
Having established that there is this connection between the integration of Android OS and Gemini, so the LLMs working under the OS, what do you really anticipate the use cases where third parties seek interoperability with Google's AI features?
I guess here we have to differentiate between different cases, as I said. So right now we have what you might call an operating system. In that operating system, it has some interfaces to whatever apps are running on the operating system. Now, AI is becoming to sit somewhere in between. It's a question whether it is a part of the operating system, and it certainly over time becomes more and more integrated into the operating system. Maybe ultimately there will not be an operating system without AI, but right now we can potentially still differentiate between the operating system, which gives access basically to the hardware on the device, including the CPU, memory, camera, and so on, and then apps that run on the device that might be using some of the AI features. So my understanding is, for example, in terms of Android, there is what Google calls the AI Core API, which basically is the API that app developers can call in order to access the AI features that come with Android and on the operating system. That is handling a lot of things. It's handling access basically to a lot of the sensors potentially, but is also handling sort of the orchestration. So if many apps call the AI at the same time, there needs to be someone that makes a call which gets priority, where you can also immediately see that maybe if Google's own services call the API, then they might get priority over requests of others. But it's also a question whether maybe a third party can provide this AI Core API or an alternative to it. So you don't have to call Google's variant of it, but you can call OpenAI's variant of it or someone else's. There is already the question right now whether and to what extent this AI Core API can be duplicated. And of course, there's also the question which the DMA tries to strike, of course, where does the operating system end? Where does the service layer, the app layer comes in? And the definition in the DMA is you cannot reasonably provide it on a standalone basis. And that's one of the things that the Commission probably needs to investigate. Is this something that could be provided as on a standalone basis or not? Is it really part of the operating system? But for sure, there is already this interface in the operating system to sort of apps on the outside. And there are several questions there. One is there any built-in priority potentially if Google calls this API versus third-party apps call it? Does Google potentially even not call that own API, but it has some direct route to the operating system and features? That might also be the case. I don't know. And to what extent can sort of others duplicate those features? Also develop, for example, an AI model that runs on the device to the same extent and with the same possible capabilities in terms of input it receives, because a feature of these new models is so-called multimodality. Multimodality means it doesn't only take text as an input, it takes various forms of input, pictures, location data, maybe data from like the GPS sensors or, the gyroscope sensors in it, on the orientation of the device, and all of these things can potentially feed into the model, and can others potentially duplicate those features? And to that extent, do we have competitive AI models that run on the device, or is this to some extent already precluded, foreclosed by the operating system, which is a core platform service, and therefore by 6.7 has to be interoperable and has to allow others to innovate on the operating system to the same extent as Google can innovate.
As you were talking about equivalents and other AI chatbot providers really getting into the Android OS, I was getting also really reminiscent about the European Commission's own specification proceeding that it finished last year with Apple's opening up of its ecosystem with regards to the features that developers could access, such as, for instance, headsets and also the request-based process. And I was wondering, having read those decisions and the implementation measures that the European Commission came up with in those decisions, do you see any potential parallels or overlaps that may apply to this particular case in Google? Because we are maybe seeking the same sense of equivalence with regards to these AI functionality.
I think there are similarities, but there are also differences. The Apple specification was mostly of allowing third-party hardware providers. I mean, not exclusively, but it was mostly about connected devices, so to say, to the iPhone. Things like headphones, they have the same sort of integration, but also other features. And here, of course, in this AI world, it's more about actual software on the device only. So that's sort of the difference. But then again, there are of course many similarities, because what the Apple specification has shown, that there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of detail there in terms of, little things you need to handle. What exactly are we talking about? What kind of things have to become interoperable? Ultimately, it is always, and will probably under 6.7 always remain, a little bit of cat and mouse race. Where the Commission has to say, we need, the principle is very clear. The principle is an equivalence of input regime. So whatever you give your own services, you have to give to others as well. But this is, of course, developing very quickly in the real world. Then, the Commission has to come in and say, you didn't give this, you gave this to your own, you developed a new interface, and that you need to open up, and so on. So equivalence of input is a good instrument per se, because we are talking about here about core platform services, right? It's not like also Apple has claimed we innovate and then we have to immediately give access to someone else to do this. But this is about the operating system ultimately, and there's only 2 mobile operating systems out there which we use. So these are real big infrastructures, and there I think it's vital to keep it open also for third-party competitors. At the same time, these are not static things. This is not like, we've seen a similar regulation in telecom markets, for example, but where these interfaces are pretty standardized and stable over time. Here, this is developing quite quickly. It is a huge challenge to keep ahead of the game for the Commission. Nevertheless, I think it's good that they take up the challenge.
Having read your work quite extensively, where you always try to narrow this gap between technology and the framing of competition policy, and you also account for both positive and negative outcomes that can arise from the introduction of digital regulation, I was wondering how you perceived the potential transformation that the specification proceeding can entail with regards to these complementers and also the ecosystem holders, so in this case Google, and what do you see as the significant hurdles for effective enforcement and effective interoperability really coming into fruition in this context?
There are also downsides with vertical interoperability. Nothing really comes for free. On balance, as I said, I think it's a good provision because we're talking about these really crucial infrastructures. But of course, when we talk about AI and also the ability to let others on the operating system to develop sort of a competing AI, in order for this AI to really work equivalently well, you need to really give it deep access to the operating system. If you were to sort of try to duplicate this core AI API of Google, you would have to give it deep access into the operating system and to a lot of sensors, which of course comes with potential security problems. Should you give access equally to everyone for that? Is it who can you let on, who can you not let on? We can immediately see that it's a very sort of intimate place in the operating system where you place this. And potentially all the apps are calling this interface. So you get a lot of data flowing from the apps to that sort of core AI engine, right? It's really becoming sort of the heart and soul potentially of the operating system in the long run. You don't want just anyone to sit there from a consumer point of view. And to make it secure and to vet and to develop the interfaces to make it secure, there's just more things you need to be concerned of if you're a developer of an operating system that comes with it. If you let others on, that is a potential downside we should be aware of. The benefit then is that we're not getting monopolized with one model. We have competition. We potentially have better models because they're still competing. Consumers can choose whether they want this model or the other model. And because they have a choice, the developers need to innovate. That's the core idea of the DMA ultimately, that we don't monopolize these infrastructures. But this is what we've seen time and again, that you dominate one layer, and from that domination, you can leverage your market power into another layer. And of course, now with the AI age, it is a fundamental shift as we move from desktop to mobile. Basically, the same gatekeepers we had in desktop also lived in the mobile age because they could successfully, including Google, leverage their market power from desktop to mobile. Now we have another revolution with AI, and it's already the case that there is really no AI without big tech today because of the compute power needed, but also because they're controlling these crucial consumer-facing interfaces. The current gatekeepers are controlling the operating systems, which the AI lives in ultimately. Right? Now, that operating system is controlled by current gatekeepers. They can potentially misuse that gatekeeping power there to leverage into them being the ones that run the future AI models. And we can totally see that. And this is why it's important to keep these interfaces open for competitors. There are potential candidates like OpenAI, for example, who could be the new sort of Google, and they're also working, by the way, on their own sort of operating systems. Ultimately, maybe we run devices by OpenAI and not by Android anymore. But at the same time, for that, they need to be also have a place in the current devices that we're using. Because the one thing that I think we can see now more recently is that while OpenAI and ChatGPT had a head start and were sort of the best models a year or two ago, Gemini is really catching up if it has not already overtaken the quality of ChatGPT. Now, if they give themselves like an advantage in what things they can do on the phone as opposed to others, that comes on top of it. And it seems like, I'm being a little bit pessimistic here, but even if the commission goes through with specifying this, but it seems like because of all these advantages that already happened or have been announced, that OpenAI as a potentially new gatekeeper in the future is having a hard time really competing against Gemini in a company like Google. But that ultimately, I guess, was the goal of the DMA, right? To allow new players to emerge and come through and to keep markets open for that kind of competition. And I would say, yes, it helps. If you're a gatekeeper, you still have a big advantage, no matter what we try to enforce under 6.7.
It might be that we have an effect that we didn't really predict, that is advantaging OpenAI with contestability. And I was wondering whether the European Commission's intervention is actually really justified on economic terms, because we know that the AI markets are now pretty unfairly open. There's an argument to be made there of we are maybe intervening too fast in these AI markets, or on the other side, we might carve out an advantage as a consequence of these interventions, because we really need to get our foot on the door, and then let's start with contestability from the first moments of the market's ignition, as opposed to having a really monopolized market and then addressing the problem.
I'm not sure I said we're intervening too early. It's actually a very tricky question in terms of when should we intervene and when not. And it also dates back a little bit to the question, what is it really the goal that the DMA has? And to be very honest, I don't think the DMA has very clear view of what it means by contestability. It means different things in different parts of the DMA. So in my view, what the idea should be is that the DMA enables that over time we see different gatekeepers emerging. It's not always the same companies that are there all the time, which means that the competition is healthy to that extent that new companies can come in and also become potentially a gatekeeper for some time. And then they're replaced by someone else. I think gatekeeping to some extent is inevitable in the digital markets. So if we think about having many players at the same time in markets that are characterized by a lot of network effects, I think that's not necessarily something we can really strive for. Markets will to some extent probably tip. But then it's the question for how long do they tip? And when can we turn this over? And this is, I think, what the goal of the DMA should be. Now, when you say there is a lot of competition for AI right now and the markets are open, I'm not so sure that's really true anymore. It is true that we have sort of different foundation models competing to some degree, but we already see a conversion coming up. So we're in the market. Currently in the state where the market has not tipped yet, but clearly companies are working towards tipping the market in their favor. And once the market has tipped, which can happen very quickly, as I said, now I think OpenAI has a lot of disadvantages and Google with Gemini has a lot of cards in their hand. They're being installed as a default. They might have some advantaged access to the operating system. If those things play out, and maybe we're already there, but in a year or so too, we will all agree that Gemini is the best model, mostly. And then there's, I guess, not so much we can do about this anymore to tip this market anymore. And then it's too late, right? So if you step in too late, then the market has tipped and it's inevitable. So I guess in this environment, and I know people will disagree with me on that, but in this environment, if really the goal is to keep things open, we need to step in a little bit earlier than before we have like this complete evidence that everything has tipped. At the same time, I said there's also cost of intervening early. I'm not claiming it's completely cost-free, but these are really important and fundamental type of interfaces we talk about that potentially should remain a little bit more open. Against that backdrop, I think the ultimate measure for me, for the DMA, is whether over time we see more change at the top, more companies coming in, that list of gatekeepers changing over time. That for me would be the ultimate test of whether the DMA is successful or not. Not that we don't have any gatekeeping at any point in time, because that I think is inevitable.
With that bombshell of replacing gatekeepers, I would guess my final comment would be that so to replace gatekeepers, we have to end with the existing one. So maybe that's a different discussion that we want to have at another moment. But in any case, thank you so much, Jan, for your intervention, all of your insights. And I think all of the audience now has an initial idea of what the European Commission is trying to do with this specification proceeding. So thanks for that. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.